The night Siddhartha left the palace, a choice that changed human history. Night has a way of softening the world until its edges blur, and in that quiet, truths that remain hidden during the day begin to surface. When movement slows and the noise of obligation fades, the mind often turns inward, not by intention but by necessity. It is in such moments that unease makes itself known, not as panic or despair, but as a subtle sense that something essential has been overlooked. Comfort may still be present, security may remain intact, yet a feeling persists that no amount of arrangement or success has truly settled the deeper questions of existence. This is not the suffering of hunger or violence or loss, but a quieter dissatisfaction that arises even when life appears complete. Human beings have always tried to manage this unease by shaping their surroundings. We build routines, identities, and stories about who we are meant to be, hoping these structures will protect us from the raw uncertainty of being alive. When these structures work, they provide relief, sometimes for years. Yet beneath them, time continues its work. Bodies age, attachments shift, joy proves fleeting. Even love, in its most beautiful forms, carries the shadow of eventual separation. These facts rarely announce themselves all at once. They arrive slowly, often resisted, sometimes disguised as success or progress. The story of Siddhartha before his awakening begins in such a landscape. It is tempting to imagine his early life as distant or symbolic, but its emotional terrain is profoundly familiar. He lived surrounded by care, pleasure, and protection, not unlike many who find themselves insulated from hardship through privilege, talent, or circumstance. Yet protection does not dissolve impermanence, it only delays confrontation with it. When awareness finally turns toward what has been hidden, the realization can be unsettling, even destabilizing. The night Siddhartha left the palace did not arise from a sudden impulse or dramatic collapse. It emerged from a long, inward ripening, shaped by observation, empathy, and an honesty that refused to be satisfied with borrowed answers. That night stands not merely as a historical moment, but as a human one, revealing what can happen when someone listens carefully to the quiet truth forming beneath a life that appears complete. To understand the weight of Siddhartha's early life, it is necessary to look beyond the familiar images of silk garments and guarded gardens and consider the deeper intention behind them. His father's effort to surround him with beauty and pleasure was not born of vanity alone, but of fear. It was a fear shared by many parents across time, the fear that suffering once seen cannot be unseen, and that knowledge of pain will alter the course of a life in ways that cannot be controlled. By keeping illness, aging, and death at a distance, the palace was meant to preserve innocence, to freeze time at its most agreeable moment. Yet innocence sustained by concealment is fragile, and time, indifferent to human planning, continues to move. Within those walls, Siddhartha learned everything a future ruler was expected to know. He was trained in leadership, educated in philosophy and statecraft, and introduced to pleasure as a natural reward for status and success. His days were structured, his seeings curated, his questions gently redirected. Nothing essential to survival or governance was withheld from him, yet something essential to wisdom was missing. The absence was not immediately felt as lack, but as a faint dissonance, a sense that the answers he had inherited did not quite reach the depth of the questions forming within him. This dissonance is familiar to many who grow up within systems designed to succeed. When life unfolds according to expectation, it can take time to notice that fulfillment and meaning are not the same. Siddhartha's world functioned smoothly. There was no immediate crisis demanding change, yet the human mind, when allowed moments of stillness, naturally presses against the limits of explanation. Why does joy fade? Why does fear linger even when nothing is wrong? Why does love, so deeply cherished, carry an undercurrent of vulnerability? These questions do not arise from failure, but from attentiveness. The encounters that would later define Siddhartha's understanding were not dramatic revelations, so much as confirmations of what his intuition had already begun to sense. Aging, illness, and death were not new realities brought into existence by his seeing them. They had always been present, silently shaping every life around him. What changed was not the world itself, but his willingness to look without turning away. Compassion does not begin with generosity or action. It begins with the courage to see clearly. In that seeing, the boundary between one's own comfort and another's suffering begins to dissolve. Equally significant was his encounter with the renunciant, the figure who had chosen to step outside the conventional paths of success and inheritance. This was not simply a man who had rejected pleasure, but someone who embodied a different relationship to uncertainty. The renunciant did not claim mastery over life, yet seemed less burdened by its instability. For Siddhartha, this was not an invitation to imitate, but a disruption of assumption. It suggested that freedom might not be found through accumulation or avoidance, but through understanding. These moments did not immediately compel him to act. They worked slowly, reshaping the internal landscape in which decisions are formed. Siddhartha continued to fulfill his roles, to love his family, to participate in the life he had been given. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The palace, once a place of effortless belonging, now felt incomplete. Not false, but insufficient. This distinction matters. His eventual leaving was not an act of rejection born of contempt, but of fidelity to a deeper truth that could no longer be ignored. When people speak of renunciation, it is often imagined as a turning away from love or responsibility. In Siddhartha's case, it arose precisely because of love. To remain within the palace while knowing that suffering was universal would have required a narrowing of empathy, a quiet agreement to let others bear what he was shielded from. His sensitivity made this impossible. Compassion, once awakened, does not allow selective concern. It insists on coherence between understanding and action. The tension he experienced was not between pleasure and pain, but between comfort and honesty. Comfort offered continuity, predictability, and belonging. Honesty demanded uncertainty, loss of status, and the willingness to walk without guarantees. Neither path was free from suffering. The difference lay in whether suffering would be numbed or understood. This is the tension that defines many turning points in human lives, though it is often expressed in less visible ways. The decision to leave a career that no longer aligns with one's value, to speak a truth that risks relationship, or to sit quietly with grief rather than distract oneself from it. Siddhartha's inner life during this period cannot be reduced to restlessness alone. It was marked by careful observation, patience, and restraint. He did not lash out against his circumstances or demand that others change. Instead, he listened. He allowed insight to mature without forcing resolution. This capacity for waiting, for letting understanding deepen before acting, is one of the most overlooked aspects of his story. Transformation in this sense was not a dramatic break, but a gradual clarification. The palace continued to stand, solid and luminous, but its meaning had shifted. What once appeared as protection now revealed itself as separation. What once felt like abundance now hinted at incompleteness. These realizations did not diminish his gratitude or love for those around him. They intensified them. To see impermanence clearly is not to withdraw affection, but to recognize its preciousness. It is precisely because things cannot be held that they matter. By the time the night of departure approached, the decision had already been made inwardly, though not yet enacted. Leaving was not a flight from responsibility, but a response to it. Siddhartha understood that answers borrowed from tradition or authority could not resolve the questions that had emerged. They required direct encounter, lived inquiry, and the humility to admit not knowing. In this sense, the palace had fulfilled its role. It had given him stability, education, and love. What it could not give was liberation from suffering, because no external structure can do that. This is where the story ceases to be distant history and becomes an intimate mirror. Many people live within their own palaces, shaped not of stone and gardens, but of habits, beliefs, and identities that once provided safety. Over time, these structures may begin to feel confining, not because they are wrong, but because they no longer reflect the depth of one's understanding. The question then arises, often quietly and without clear language, whether to remain where one is known, or to step into uncertainty in service of truth. Siddhartha's choice did not arise from certainty of outcome, but from clarity of intention. He did not know what awaited him beyond the palace walls. He only knew that to remain would require turning away from what he had seen. The courage of that recognition, more than the act itself, is what gives the moment its enduring significance. It reveals a form of bravery that does not rely on confidence or conquest, but on honesty, compassion, and the willingness to be changed by what one has understood. Once Siddhartha crossed the threshold of the palace, the world did not immediately reveal its answers. There was no sudden clarity, no voice from the dark announcing that the path ahead would lead to awakening. What met him instead was exposure. Without the buffers of privilege and routine, life appeared more raw, more immediate. Hunger, fatigue, uncertainty, and doubt became companions rather than distant concepts. This was not a fall from grace, but an encounter with the ordinary conditions shared by all beings. The significance of this encounter lies not in hardship itself, but in the way it dismantled the illusion that meaning could be preserved through separation. The first phase of his wandering was marked by seeking, not yet by understanding. Siddhartha approached teachers, disciplines, and philosophies with sincerity and intensity. He learned quickly, mastering meditative states and intellectual frameworks that promised transcendence. For a time, these practices seemed to offer what the palace could not: depth, focus, and a sense of purpose grounded in renunciation. Yet even here, another subtle dissonance emerged. The peace achieved through extreme discipline proved temporary. The mind could be trained, the body subdued, but suffering, in its most fundamental form, remained unresolved. This realization was not a rejection of effort or commitment. It was a refinement of inquiry. Siddhartha began to see that suffering could not be overcome by force, whether through indulgence or denial. Both approaches assumed that the problem lay in the external conditions of life, either to be maximized or eliminated. What gradually became clear was that suffering was more intimately tied to perception itself, to the way the mind grasped, resisted, and identified. This was not an idea to be accepted or debated, but a pattern to be observed directly. The ascetic practices he undertook pushed the body to its limits. In the cultural context of his time, such practices were respected and admired, seen as proof of spiritual seriousness. Yet respect from others did not translate into liberation. Weakness of the body did not quiet the restless movements of the mind. If anything, it sharpened them. Hunger brought clarity at moments, but also obsession. Pain focused attention, but also narrowed compassion. Siddhartha's honesty would not allow him to mistake endurance for insight. The turning point came not as a dramatic collapse, but as a sober acknowledgement. He recognized that the path of self-mortification, like the path of self-indulgence, was shaped by craving, the craving to become something other than what one is. In this case, it was the craving to purify, to conquer the body, to escape vulnerability. Letting go of this approach required humility, for it meant admitting that years of effort had not led where they were meant to go. This admission was not defeat. It was clarity. When Siddhartha accepted nourishment again, it was a quiet but radical act. It signaled a shift from striving toward understanding, from punishment toward care. This was not a return to comfort, but an alignment with balance. The body, once treated as an obstacle, was now recognized as a condition through which rareness unfolds. This recognition marked the beginning of a different kind of attention, one that neither indulged nor suppressed experience, but allowed it to be known as it is. Sitting beneath the tree, his posture was ordinary, his resolve unadorned. There was no expectation of revelation, only a willingness to remain present with whatever arose. Thoughts came and went. Memories surfaced. Fears spoke in familiar voices. Desire made its subtle promises. None of these were treated as enemies. None were followed. They were observed with steadiness, not as distractions to be eliminated, but as phenomena to be understood. In this sustained attention, something fundamental shifted. What unfolded was not the acquisition of new beliefs, but the falling away of false ones. The idea of a fixed self, separate and enduring, began to loosen. The assumption that happiness could be secured through control or identity gradually dissolved. Suffering revealed itself not as an external force imposed upon life, but as a process arising from clinging, resistance, and misunderstanding. This insight was not abstract. It was felt in the body, seen in the mind, confirmed in the simple act of breathing without grasping. Compassion in this context was no longer a moral ideal. It emerged naturally from seeing that the patterns shaping one's own suffering were not unique. They were shared. The restlessness of the mind, the fear of loss, the hunger for certainty, these were universal movements. To understand them in oneself was to understand them in others. Separation softened, judgment lost its footing. The world was no longer divided into those who suffer and those who do not, but into beings caught in varying expressions of the same conditions. The significance of Siddhartha's awakening does not lie in its supernatural framing, but in its ordinariness. Nothing was added to the world. No new substance appeared. What changed was the quality of attention. This is why the event resonates across cultures and centuries. It does not depend on belief in miracles or divine intervention. It rests on a possibility available to anyone willing to look carefully and honestly at experience as it unfolds. After this awakening, Siddhartha did not retreat into isolation or remain absorbed in personal peace. Understanding brought responsibility. To see clearly was to feel compelled to respond. Yet the response was not driven by urgency or a desire to convince. It was shaped by patience. He hesitated to teach, aware that insight cannot be transferred as information. It must be cultivated through direct seeing. This hesitation reveals another layer of his maturity. He recognized the limits of language and the danger of turning understanding into doctrine. When he did begin to speak, it was not to declare truth, but to point toward experience. His words were shaped by compassion rather than authority. He spoke to people where they were, using metaphors drawn from daily life, acknowledging doubt without condemning it. This approach reflects the depth of his insight. He understood that suffering is not resolved through agreement, but through investigation. The transformation that began on the night he left the palace thus reached its completion, not in isolation, but in relationship. Siddhartha's journey was never about personal salvation alone. From the beginning, it was intertwined with the recognition that liberation, if it is to mean anything, must be accessible, grounded, and responsive to the conditions of ordinary life. His awakening did not remove him from the world, it returned him to it with clarity. For those listening now, this phase of the story offers a quiet reassurance. The path from confusion to understanding is not linear. It includes detours, missteps, and the courage to let go of approaches that no longer serve. Insight is not earned through severity, nor granted through comfort. It arises through sustained attention, honesty, and a willingness to remain present with what is difficult without being consumed by it. Siddhartha's journey after leaving the palace reminds us that stepping away from old structures does not immediately reveal new ones. There is often a long period of uncertainty, where familiar reference points have dissolved and new understanding has not yet stabilized. This liminal space can feel disorienting, even frightening. Yet it is precisely here that the deepest learning occurs. Without the protection of certainty, the mind becomes capable of seeing what was previously obscured. In this sense, the night of departure was not a single event, but the beginning of a process that required patience, resilience, and humility. The true departure was not from a palace, but from the need to resolve life on one's own terms. What followed was not mastery over existence, but intimacy with it. This intimacy, grounded in awareness rather than control, would become the foundation of everything that came after. After awakening, Siddhartha's life entered a phase that is often misunderstood, not because it is complex, but because it resists dramatic framing. There was no retreat into silence for the sake of preservation, no insistence on separation from the world that had once been left behind. Instead, there was a gradual re-entry, guided by discernment rather than obligation. The understanding that had emerged in stillness now had to meet the unpredictable textures of human life. Insight, if it was to remain alive, had to prove itself amid conversation, misunderstanding, resistance, and grief. What had changed most profoundly was not Siddhartha's external situation, but his relationship to experience. Pleasure no longer promised permanence, nor did pain demand avoidance. Praise and blame lost their authority to define identity. This did not render him indifferent or detached in the cold sense of the word. On the contrary, it allowed him to engage without being consumed. He could listen without needing to correct, respond without needing to persuade, and remain present without requiring agreement. This quality of presence would become the quiet foundation of his influence. Those who encountered him were often struck not by his words alone, but by the space he seemed to carry with him. It was a space that did not rush to fill silence, did not recoil from uncertainty, and did not demand that suffering be resolved before it could be acknowledged. In a world accustomed to answers that promise control, this presence felt unfamiliar. It invited reflection rather than compliance. People felt seen, not measured. Teaching for Siddhartha was never an act of transmission in the conventional sense. He did not offer a system to adopt or an identity to assume. He offered attention. His guidance consistently returned people to their own experience, encouraging them to notice the movements of the mind, the arising of craving, the subtle ways clinging shaped distress. This approach required patience, both from the one who spoke and the one who listened. It asked for participation rather than belief. The communities that formed around him were not united by doctrine alone, but by a shared willingness to look honestly at life. They were composed of people from varied backgrounds, carrying different wounds, hopes, and confusion. Some were drawn by the promise of peace, others by curiosity, still others by desperation. Siddhartha met them without hierarchy. His understanding had dissolved the assumption that suffering could be ranked or compared. Each person's struggle was real because it was experienced, not because it met some external threshold. This period of his life reveals an often overlooked aspect of awakening, its ethical dimension. Seeing clearly does not end responsibility, it clarifies it. When one understands how suffering arises, one becomes accountable for how one participates in its continuation or easing. Siddhartha's conduct reflected this understanding. He spoke carefully, aware of the weight words can carry. He moved through the world lightly, attentive to the impact of his presence. This was not a performance of virtue, but a natural extension of insight. The simplicity of his life after awakening was not an aesthetic choice, but a practical one. Without the need to maintain status, defend identity, or secure permanence, life could be lived with fewer complications. This simplicity made space for responsiveness. It allowed him to adjust his approach according to the person before him, rather than imposing a fixed method. Such flexibility is only possible when one is not invested in being right. Over time, the implications of that single night when Siddhartha left the palace became increasingly apparent. What began as a personal reckoning with suffering unfolded into a shift in how countless people understood their own lives. Yet this influence did not spread through force or persuasion. It spread through resonance. People recognized something in his way of being that mirrored their own unarticulated longing for clarity and ease. It is important to note that Siddhartha did not frame his journey as exceptional. He did not suggest that awakening required special conditions or rare capacities. He emphasized ordinary experience as the ground of understanding. Breathing, walking, eating, speaking. These were not distractions from the path, but expressions of it. This insistence on the ordinary is what makes his story enduringly relevant. It refuses to place liberation beyond reach. As years passed, aging and illness touched his body as they touch all bodies. Awakening did not grant immunity from physical decline. What it altered was the relationship to it. Pain was felt, but it was not compounded by resistance. Change was acknowledged without bitterness. Even death, when it approached, was met not as a failure of understanding, but as its final confirmation. Impermanence had never been a problem to solve. It was a reality to live within. Looking back at the night Siddhartha left the palace from this later vantage point, its significance becomes clearer. That moment was not about abandoning a particular life, but about refusing to live in denial. It marked the beginning of a commitment to truth that would shape every subsequent action. The palace represented more than luxury. It symbolized any structure that promises safety by limiting awareness. Leaving it was an act of fidelity to what had been seen. For contemporary listeners, the relevance of this story does not depend on historical accuracy alone. It rests in its capacity to illuminate choices that arise quietly in ordinary lives. Many people today live in conditions of relative comfort while carrying an unspoken sense of disconnection. They move through routines that function well enough, yet feel subtly misaligned with something deeper. The question they face is not whether to leave everything behind, but whether to stop turning away from what they already know. Part 3 of this reflection, then, is not about the triumph of enlightenment, but about integration. It is about how insight becomes embodied over time through consistency rather than intensity. Siddhartha's life after awakening demonstrates that understanding is not a peak experience to be preserved, but a way of meeting each moment as it arises. It is tested in relationship, in disappointment, in repetition, and in fatigue. Perhaps the most radical aspect of his legacy lies here. He did not promise escape from the world, but intimacy with it. He did not deny suffering, but revealed its causes in ways that made easing it possible. He did not position himself above others, but alongside them as one who had looked carefully and found that clarity, once discovered, asks to be shared not as truth, but as invitation. The night he left the palace changed human history not because it initiated a religion or a philosophy, but because it modeled a different response to being alive. It suggested that when comfort and truth diverge, choosing truth need not lead to despair. It can lead to a deeper, quieter freedom, one that does not depend on circumstance and does not require withdrawal from the world. That freedom is not dramatic. It is steady. It is lived. And it remains available wherever someone is willing to pause, look honestly, and take a step toward what they already sense to be true. As this reflection comes to rest, it is worth returning once more to the stillness of that first night, not to romanticize it, but to understand its enduring echo. Siddhartha did not leave the palace in search of meaning as something distant or exotic. He left because meaning, as it truly is, could no longer be avoided. The suffering he had seen was not an abstract problem, and the questions it raised were not philosophical diversions. They were the quiet facts of being human, waiting patiently for attention. His choice reminds us that clarity often begins not with certainty, but with the willingness to remain present when familiar explanations fall away. What followed that night was not a path of perfection, but one of deepening alignment. Insight was refined through experience, tested by doubt, and expressed through relationship. The significance of Siddhartha's life does not lie in an idealized image of awakening, but in the steady way understanding was lived over time. This steadiness is perhaps the most overlooked aspect of his legacy. It suggests that transformation is not a single moment that absolves us from difficulty, but an ongoing responsiveness to life as it unfolds, again and again. For those listening now, the story does not ask for imitation or belief. It does not demand withdrawal from family, work, or society. It simply invites an honest look at where comfort may have replaced truth, and where fear may have shaped the boundaries of awareness. The palace, in this sense, is not somewhere to leave behind physically. It is any place where we have learned to look away from impermanence in order to feel safe. To recognize this is not to judge oneself, but to begin seeing more clearly. The night Siddhartha left the palace changed human history, because it demonstrated that liberation is not reserved for the exceptional, nor granted by circumstance. It arises when someone chooses to stop turning away from what is already known in the heart. That choice, made quietly and without guarantees, continues to unfold wherever attention deepens and compassion widens. If these reflections have stirred something familiar in you, you are welcome to continue walking alongside them here, returning whenever you wish, listening not for answers, but for the deeper understanding that grows through careful presence and shared contemplation.